Hi, I'm Betsy Rosenberg. Great to be back with you on Green TV. This begins our third week on greentv.com. I hope you like it. We'd love to hear your comments. Please share it. We want to let people know that we're going to be having such a fantastic lineup because I've been covering this beat, for those of you who don't know, for about 2 decades. And so you meet a lot of people and you interview a lot of authors and many, many experts. And the guy who to me is synonymous with sustainability and business or corporate responsibility, all those terms, ESG that we're hearing about now, most of the public's hearing about now, many of us have been talking about it for quite a few years. I think of Andrew Winston. He's been at all the conferences I've gone to, one especially Sustainable Brands, and he is out with his 4th book. So I thought, what better time than to check in? This one is called Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, which probably is a good rule of thumb for marriage and a lot of things in life. Give more than you take. But that is barely the beginning of your literary careers. Andrew, there's more titles than I can read here. So go ahead and tell us sort of when you started on this path and how.
Right. Well, great. Thanks, Betsy. Thanks for having me again. It's been a while, but I think I've been on a few times.
That was this is TV. This is more fun.
Yeah, this is video. We're evolving as we're all getting used to.
Our hair gets a little grayer, but
yeah,
we're still
I've definitely gotten grayer. So my first book came out 15 years ago in 2006, Green to Gold, and that's kind of the thing that kicked off my career. I had been working in this space for a little while, but that was kind of the first big publication. I wrote a short, kind of quick book at the beginning of the recession in 2009 called Green Recovery. And then my next kind of larger book was Big Pivot in 2014. And now this new one, Net Positive, which is co-authored with Paul Polman, who most people in sustainability know was the CEO of Unilever for a decade. You know, I do a lot of writing, magazine articles, other things, and speaking around the world and you know, consulting with companies. Kind of my mission is to drive companies down a different path, you know, help them see that they can solve the world's problems and profit doing it.
So what has changed in the last decade before we drill down into the details, nitty gritty? Because on the one hand, it seems like things have gotten much better in terms of public awareness. Yeah. On the other hand, we've learned that some of the promises and goals made by big corporations sound good, but they aren't necessarily either doing them or making enough of a difference.
Yeah, we should come back on the goals thing. I think it's a critical part of my work for years, and it's a big part of the story. I mean, I think, you know, so I got into this field about 20 years ago, and sometimes it feels like nothing's changed. You know, you have some of the same conversations, but there's clearly been something that's shifted, right? And I'd say in the last couple of years in particular, we've seen more of a change in the role of business in society, or what's expected of business, than in the previous 20. But on the, you know, corporate sustainability realm, we've come to a place now where it's on everyone's agenda. Right. It's every large company has a sustainability report, has goals around carbon or energy and other things. So on some level, we won, right? We won the first battle, which is get this on the agenda and get it out of this realm of being seemingly anti-business or some, you know, liberal plot to take over business or something like that. And I think we won that first battle. There's still skeptics and all that, but nobody seriously challenges that we need to talk about climate change or diversity or, you know, a whole range of issues. So that has changed. And the level of ambition and goal setting that companies are embarking on has changed. Unfortunately, what's also changed is the horizon we're shooting for, the climate problem, the level of inequality, the biodiversity loss. So we're kind of chasing this horizon that's moving away from us even faster than we're moving. So I think the dichotomy or the yin yang of being in this field is that we're winning and losing. And that's just tough to kind of get your head around, right? You can feel like it's useless, but it's not. But we still have a lot of work to do.
That is so well put, because that's exactly, it feels like we're going faster. We are bringing more along with us, but we are still heading for a cliff and it's coming closer as we're moving towards it. Yeah. And yet, if we panic, you know, in the broad sense, in any sense, really, that won't do anybody any good. Getting paralyzed with fear, although fear is appropriate, is not going to work. So it's got to be that, you know, in between being overly optimistic, because we know what that can do. People assume technology will come and fix all this mess, but also, you know, be appropriately, feel the urgency appropriately, I would say, and feel the need to really move together, move swiftly, but move smartly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have that fight or flight instinct, and we have it as a species, and it's a fine line between it being debilitating and being like the adrenaline rush, like the proverbial lifting a car off your child or whatever. Like we kind of need to do that globally on climate and other issues. So we need that urgency, but not so much that we feel like we can't act or that it's too much to handle. We have to find that balance. It's challenging.
Before we move on to what's next and what needs to come, let's talk about COVID for a minute, because I feel like after this 18-month period where everybody changed, life changed, and it does have a connection to nature, and it does have to do with social behavior change, that the big lessons haven't really been absorbed. And by that, what I mean by that is that, nature's the boss, and it's a small world, and that things can go south really quickly. And when they do, we can change if appropriate attention is put on it by the media, for instance, which it was for COVID, not so much climate.
Yeah.
Do you feel like people got that message outside your green circles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, I'd like to be more hopeful about it. I guess the fact that we have to act on something really large, I think, was a lesson that we've taken. But I would have thought or hoped that we would take this major understanding of how connected we all are. I mean, quite literally, we share an immune system, right? I mean, so that's the most connected, but that the problems we face now are so interconnected. Climate and inequality, biodiversity, they are all related. Public health, diversity and inclusion, it is all related, right? We saw
literally the air we breathe.
Right, the air we breathe, and then we saw the kind of outcomes with COVID by race, by income level were vastly different. So it highlighted inequality, it highlighted all these things. But I mean, it's really too bad is an understatement. But as I've started traveling again a little bit and get out there and you see literally everyone around you wearing masks on planes and whatever, I thought, wow, this was an opportunity for the first time really in human history. We all had to do something together. We're all doing the same thing right now, right? Everyone's got to wear masks. We got to socially distance. And we could have taken this as this amazing opportunity to connect. And instead, at least in the US, there's people who have used it to drive an even bigger wedge, right? By playing on people's fear and ignorance and, misinformation. And I just, it's hard not to find that disheartening, because we could have used this as a leaping point to say, okay, if we can come together and tackle something as big as a shared pandemic, we can do this with climate, we can do this with other issues. And I hope that, there's some sense of that, out there that I think companies have to some extent. So many of them pivoted and did amazing things in the months and year and a half since the pandemic started to change, to make different things, things that the healthcare community needed, that we needed in hospitals, to help their employees, help their customers. There was a lot of that where they shifted quickly. I'm hoping they learn that we can move, we can change how we do things.
And the fact that science got politicized and there was polarization around, climate change and COVID, I mean, that sets us back. It really does, especially with mainstream media not doing its part, one of my focus points. And then Fox still, disinforming the public and getting paid a lot of money to do that, getting rewarded for that. Right. And that's a life and death issue. These are life and death issues. And I think there's a little bit more awareness of that for those who don't watch Fox. We're kind of horrified, like, really, you can 2020 get away with lying about scientific facts. That's clearly got to stop, but it has slowed things down.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's a race between Fox and Facebook for what has created more damage. I think Fox is willful and trying to play up fear, and it gets them their version of clicks or eyeballs. I mean, it's the game they play. But the Facebook algorithm and the pushing of misinformation and the fact that the things that make you the angriest and are often the least true are the things that rise higher in the algorithm and get shared more. It's an incredibly broken system and unbelievably dangerous. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, but these are some root problems that keep us from acting in a way that helps solve shared problems, right? We get lost in these cries for freedom over, shared good, common good.
Yeah, you have the freedom, I guess, to not wear a mask or get vaccinated, but I also have the freedom to live. It's
Right,
like, come on, people. And don't
right.
get me started on the whole abortion freedom thing, hypocrisy there. We won't go there
Yeah,
because I have so many
yeah,
things I want to ask you about. So just before we pivot away from the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about building back better or building forward,
yeah.
better. Do you think that's really penetrated all the way to Washington, D.C., or your area of expertise
Yeah.
to companies of all sizes?
I think so. I mean, look, the Biden administration has made it core. They're trying to pass this reconciliation bill, which is the least sexy word for the probably the largest funding for climate action in human history. If we can get it passed, right? Hundreds of billions going to EV infrastructure, efficiency, buildings, et cetera. Um, and they keep calling it this $3.5 trillion bill, which is a weird thing because that's over 10 years. And it's kind of meaningless because in the bill, they've got tax increases on basically wealthy and the wealthy and corporations to pay for it. So it's really a $0 bill from a deficit, debt perspective. But we kind of talk about it like this giant spending versus the investment that it is. I think the Build Back Better idea is big in Europe. It's big here. I mean, there's definitely a push for it, right? To say there's things that are broken. We realize that now. The healthcare system had aspects that were broken. We realize supply chains were broken in many ways. Like that, we definitely need to build back better. I don't know if it's all going to pass, right? I mean, I think companies are strange, right? They're not monolithic. They can do some things really great and some things poorly. And right
They're
now,
not humans.
they're not human, but their behavior around these kinds of things like these bills that will invest is not great because for the most part, if you read articles in the Times, I saw something in Rolling Stone, companies are basically fighting this package because it'll raise corporate taxes. When, especially if you're in a sector that relies on this spending, like you're the auto industry, you're trying to get to all EVs, that won't happen unless we build out charging stations. Like it just won't, right? And so here's spending at the government level, but they don't like that there's raises in the corporate tax rate or in the capital gains rate. And the question I keep having for people is, well, then how do we want to pay for it? Like, what do you want to do to pay for the build out we need to do to the clean economy? And who's supposed to pay for it, if not kind of the most prosperous in our society? So the companies are not acting, I think, in their best interest because they're still caught in this, we're supposed to fight all regulation and fight all tax increases. And I think it's a shame. And it's something we talk about a net positive about. Do companies pay their taxes? Are they contributing to society through that means of helping fund society? And I think it's something companies need to get kind of called out on the carpet about and brought into the public light.
And some of the billionaires like Jeff Bezos, who has just pledged, I
Yeah.
believe, $1 billion towards biodiversity. Even the Koch brothers, I guess, had some too late in life guilt. So, they're trying to do some good environmentally, which just
Yeah.
makes me like, where have you been? And Bill Gates, finally got around to
Yep.
make climate his top priority. That's all great. It feels a little bit like too little too late, given those of us who follow this know the climate window has been closing and
Right.
and climate change is here. But do you see that as significant because they are the big ones and are others mid-sized, smaller companies, but with names
Yeah.
we all know of?
Look, it's great to see some of these billionaires say something. I mean, we could have a long conversation about Bezos. I don't think he cares that much about the climate or environment, really. But I think, I mean, we have a system for collecting what we need to build our society, and it's called a tax base. I mean, like it's to have to rely on the galactically wealthy to
do good.
donate is a crazy way to run a society or a system, and is unnecessary, right? We have a way to do this. It doesn't mean every tax is perfect or every tax is implemented perfectly, but there's a choice we make as a society. If you look across countries, there's basically a rough percentage of GDP or whatever measure you want that is taxed. There's a certain percentage of GDP that comes into the government as tax revenue. In the countries with high social welfare, like Scandinavia, Northern Europe, it might be 40% of GDP. In the US, it's like 25%. And in developing countries that don't have enough to thrive, it might be 10%, right? And so we make choices as a society, and it's the countries that I think thrive and are happiest and have infrastructure, both social and environmental, have a higher percentage of tax revenue. It's just that simple, right? It's just a matter of how do we want to fund the things that need to happen. We tend to believe in privatization and free markets here. I think to a fault, right? I mean, free markets are great, but they can't solve everything, and it's silly to rely on them for everything. That's not their purpose.
There's no good profits on a bad and dying planet.
Right.
We're going to wake up and smell that bit of carbon.
Yeah.
Well, let's get to your latest book, Net Positive. We hear a lot about net zero, and there were a lot of pledges during this past climate week in New York. All these companies are pledging net zero by 2050. 2050, when I hear that, seems so far away. And yet we have less than a decade to cut our emissions in half as a society. And you probably have children. I have a daughter who's 26. That went really fast. So, if we have less than 10 years to change almost everything about our economy and energy system, for one, we're not going to do that without some mainstream programming. That's my focus. But do you see this as even possible? And when you hear 2050, do you do what I do and many others to say, that's just too late?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, 2050 is both too far and not that far. I mean, someone said the other day, like, it's closer than 1993 or something, like dates that I remember very well, that for those of us Gen X or older, it doesn't feel that far, and 2030 is really not far, right? I mean, how especially with kids, how fast. I just took my first to college last week, which was emotional and bizarre, so weird on so many levels. Yeah, it's exciting, but it is surreal.
That goes really fast.
Right. I mean, I've seen nephews, nieces, friends go through college, and all of a sudden they're out, right? It just happens so fast. We're not going fast enough, right? That's the core of why, in a way, we wrote Net Positive, was we need a movement, and it needs to be more aggressive and more regenerative and restorative than just net zero. We try not to get into the semantics debate of the terminology. I mean, carbon neutral, carbon negative, carbon positive, they all mean somewhat the same thing. We're kind of using different language. What we're not doing is talking about what's been kind of net carbon neutral, meaning buy some renewable energy credits and you're even. When we talk about net positive, we're defining it as a company that improves the well-being of everyone that they impact or touch across their business and their societal impact. So improving the well-being of all their stakeholders, their employees, their consumers, the customers, the communities, across every dimension of their business, every product, every service, every factory, every country they operate in. And that's the North Star. That's kind of the goal. Nobody's there yet, but it's much broader than just saying we got to get to zero carbon and maybe go a little further. It's really about the core question is the world better off because your company is in it? And that's the goal, right? That your company is creating a positive impact in all that they do. And so we're defining it pretty broadly. And that means that to get there, you have to embrace a lot of big picture stuff, setting really big goals, finding purpose in a deep way. And the core of the book is really about partnership and how we need to get to the kind of systemic partnerships where you have business, civil society, and government working together, right? Not just fighting over regulations, but saying, what's the system that we need that solves the larger problem that we all share? And that serves everybody's best interest, really, in the longer term. I mean, the net positive is really fundamentally about taking a longer term view, taking a multi-stakeholder view, like serving a lot of stakeholders, not just shareholders, and taking kind of ownership and responsibility for the way your business affects the world in really broad terms, and owning that, right? And that's something that I think companies haven't really embraced. We talk about it, but it's radical in a way to really take that in.
So there's been a need for accountability, for transparency. It's what we're talking about, but do you really see, enough companies going in that direction, or is it just a few who are leading the pack? That's one question. And the other part of that, when you hear these pledges, net zero by whenever, does that mean they have to know how they're going to get there? Do they have to have a plan to back that up? Or are they setting the goal and they'll figure it out later and hoping to heck that technology comes along that will help them do that?
Yeah, I think basically for most companies, we can't know how to do some of it. I mean, we don't really know what zero carbon looks like in 2050 or half, and we have some sense of getting rid of half of your carbon. And I think that the leading companies really are setting goals without knowing exactly how to do it. Microsoft and Google in particular have set the most aggressive carbon goals to be retroactively neutral, to take more carbon out of the air than they've emitted since founding. Google has a goal to be 24/7 renewable energy powered by 2030, meaning every minute, every hour, they have renewable electrons. And that means having solar, wind on site, big storage. If you plug into a grid, it has to be zero carbon as well. I mean, and nobody knows how to do that exactly. There's a bunch of things that need to happen, but they're looking at systemic change. How do we change the grid? How do we work with suppliers and partners and peers and utilities and the government to get there? So we have to set goals that we don't know exactly how to do.
Is it just coincidental that Microsoft, Google, and some of the other ones that are ahead have the most money?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. People have said that a lot. Like I used to, before the big tech companies were involved, obviously Walmart was talking about sustainability years ago, and they were one of the first to set a 100% renewable goal before anybody really had. And they were starting to put solar on the roof, and lots of other retailers were starting to do it. And I always get comments
they were
like, "Well,
impacting their supply chain, and because they are the big
right.
one, yeah, that.
But I often get comments like, "Well, they can do it because they have money," and I'm like, "Do you know Walmart? Have you ever seen them do something that's cost them more money? Like that's not how they operate. That's never how they operated." So I find it odd because pretty much every time like Walmart and others have gone through the work and the research and put up renewables, it's because it's basically they think save them money or reduce their risk or there's some benefit to it. They're not doing it for philanthropy. So it's funny because I don't think what the big tech companies are doing necessarily costs a lot of cash, right? They have leeway to do lots of things, and they're sitting on. I mean, Apple I think has $300 or $400 billion in cash, but that's not really what's driving this. It's a recognition that their footprint is much bigger maybe than tech companies thought it was. They were always treated in rankings and things like they didn't have a footprint because they're digital. But as you know, the biggest energy user in California is Google, right? I mean, like the cloud is not light. It's very heavy. And so they've realized they have this huge energy need and a risk from energy, because if they're reliant on the grid so much and storms can come in, prices can go up and down, they're better off having their own supply of renewable energy. So it's just good business for them, but it is also taking ownership that they have a big footprint. So I don't think it's because they have a lot of cash. They're not really doing anything that, I mean, renewables are now cheaper. So it's,
point.
it's not, I think there's a few things they have leeway to try. Microsoft's getting into carbon sequestration technologies, investing a little money, but not a ton. So yeah, I think it makes sense for the business rather than it's because they have so much money.
Another one that is standing out suddenly, relatively recently, is Salesforce and Mark Benioff.
Yeah.
Trillion tree pledge, I believe.
Yeah.
And they're, they seem serious about this, but they're another big one with a lot of resources.
Well, and they're not afraid to jump in on social things, like their statement about people, women and families in Texas, their employees, if they wanted to leave or relocate because they didn't feel safe or felt like they had reproductive health protection.
That was not in the budget ahead of time, because who could have foreseen that?
No, I mean, and Salesforce has gotten involved, I think, in local homeless issues and housing issues in San Francisco and the places they operate. Again, it's taking a broader view of your impacts and your effect on society. And I think they have become a real leader on thinking broader and just speaking truth, and trying to get involved in some of the biggest challenges that we have.
You talk about the elephant in the room. And what do you mean by that in the corporate business sense?
Yeah, so one of the things we have in the book that in the early readers that have seen it, they've all told us this was the chapter that kind of really grabbed them, was late in the book. We have a chapter called The Elephants in the Room, basically the things that nobody wants to talk about that companies try to avoid. And the case we make is you have to look at these things if you actually want to have a positive impact. And so it's a list of topics like, do you pay your taxes? Do companies pay the taxes like we talked about before? Corruption issues around the world, kind of broader inclusivity and diversity, dealing with the executive compensation levels. Like we basically say, CEOs make too much money. I mean, it's just flat out totally warped now.
It's obscene.
Right?
It's obscene.
It's obscene, and it doesn't actually serve. It doesn't serve the business. It doesn't serve really anybody but a very small pool of people. So we call these issues out and don't have all the answers, but just say, here's the issue. Here's the value it's sucking from the company, from society. And here's some of the things you can do. There are projects, initiatives, alliances, like working on all these issues now. There's work on setting a tax rate across, all countries, right? Biden has actually come out in favor of a 15% kind of across the board tax rate for companies. That's kind of the minimum that the OECD wants to pursue. Like there are initiatives, and I think that the leading companies need to kind of get on board and realize that they're not really winning by going down the path they've gone down. It really doesn't serve them in the long run.
You talk about sucking value, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. Is that something you're hoping for, or positive about,
Yeah,
or skeptical?
Yes and no. I mean, I was just listening to a podcast by the Energy Gang. Those guys cover this kind of technology. They were just talking about this because there's a new sequestration project in Iceland powered by geothermal, so it's green, but it's going to take 4,000 tons a year out of. I mean, so 4,000, right? We need gigatons, billions. Like the problem is we're so far from scale that shouldn't necessarily stop us. Like solar was once tiny, offshore wind was tiny, right? Like we can get
somewhere.
Right, you have to start somewhere, and we have a problem that most people don't really realize, that even if we hit the kind of carbon budget out of carbon by 2050, the IPCC plan and budget actually includes massive sequestration in the second half of the century. We only get to 2100 without huge sea level rise and everything if we are not only getting to zero but then start to take CO2 out. So we kind of have to find technologies for this, but nobody's shown that there's a way to do this at scale, right? Think about the amount of carbon you'd have to put under the ocean or into rock formations. It's just really, really difficult. So I know we have to, but we're so far from it that clearly we need to invest, but we just got to do things like insulate every building, put solar on every building, paint things white. Like the easy stuff is still out there, while we invest in the kind of deeper, bigger changes.
And stopping waste, being more efficient with all our resources, beginning with energy. Yeah, it's I guess you can't really compare it to anything else on this scale, where we have to, and we're not doing it fast enough, big enough, and we have to, and we're not, and we have to. It's like, right. What happens if we don't make it? And of course, it's not like we all fall off the planet and then she'll be fine, Mother Earth, which she will be, after throwing us off like so many ants, as the expression goes. But right. Really, that things are going to get progressively, maybe faster than anyone could have dreamt, worse for humans and all living creatures.
Exactly. I mean, it's weird that it's so hard for us to kind of get that we're part of a web of life. I mean, it sounds like we're hippies or so touchy-feely, but it's like we are a species, right? We are an animal. And we're having a debate in my town about, it's dumb, these local debates, but it relates to there's a pollinator path thing being built in the region where they're trying to create blocked off areas and people to grow wildflowers and things so you can help the bees. It seems so out there and touchy-feely, but like without the bees, like we don't actually survive, right? I mean, like it's weird how many things are like that, right? Add sustainable brands.
They're responsible for pollinate. Third of our food.
We don't have enough food. Right. Someone spoke at Sustainable Brands a few years ago where they gave a whole thing about ants. I don't know if you were there, and they were saying basically without ants, we die. Like ants keep the soil.
I believe it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things like that, and the coral is dying. Like we have some serious issues that I think we'll make it, but we're creating a much less rich world, and that's dangerous and also just less fulfilling, right? For our kids, for us, it's unfortunate.
It sure is. And among other words we could use, the shifting baseline concept really scares me. How, I grew up playing outside. I'm sure you did too, even after dark, and our kids didn't. And I played with tadpoles in the creek, our neighborhood. My daughter, maybe at camp she did, but not, in our house, because kids didn't go out and play that much. There's cars, there's kidnappers, whatever. And I'm a nature lover, but she did get a lot of that at camp in Maine. But it's the fact that they don't know what they're missing. And then the next generation doesn't know what they're missing. The Last Tree in the Woods, I think, forgetting the name of the author, but that one really had a big impact on me. So let's wrap up here. We're running a little bit close to the end of our time together, although there's plenty we could talk about. What would you like to tell our viewers? What should they think about what they can do? They may be running a company of their own, but they may not be. They're just consumers, as we call them. Yeah. But they're very concerned. They don't want to, go limp. They don't want to get paralyzed. They're motivated, but they just don't know what to do, where to begin. And if they are beginning already, if they drive a hybrid or electric car and they compost and they recycle and all those easier things to do that everyone really must start doing, at least those who can afford, and the prices have to come down. But to go beyond that.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's a lot of answers to that. I mean, to do kind of my personal plug, at first, I think, I'd love as many people as possible to kind of join the net positive movement. We want to get as many people as possible thinking about these issues. I mean, I want my book to do well, but I really want the ideas out there. So come visit netpositive.world, our website, and sign up, pre-order the book if you can. I think, we're trying to get this style of thinking into business and into life. We think it's something that all of us need to understand, not just business executives, but those of us who influence business, which is really everybody. And so that's, the answer for what I always tell people they can do is use their voice. The obvious is voting for people who want action on climate. And we dance around this in the US, but that is almost by definition one party now. I mean, we try, I don't know why we try to pretend there's a bipartisan thing happening. There isn't on climate or inequality.
Or politicizing these issues and
right.
polarizing the parties.
Right. I mean, there's one party with really no national figure, I think, that will vote for climate action of any real sort. So we have to get people in power, and whether that means primaries and things that change who the GOP are, or just Democrats in control, we're not going to get climate action without that happening. So voting obviously matters. Getting involved locally, I think I'm on my town legislature locally. There's, your state reps, all these things I never really knew much about before the Trump era started, and I started, to get more engaged. A lot of stuff happens town, county, state level. So, get knowledgeable about the things that are happening on, clean energy bills in your state, understand what's happening. And then, use your voice as an employee. I think, especially the young people, it really affects business when they hear from their own people. And I think we need systemic change, right? I could tell you, drive the hybrid, get a smaller house, all that stuff. But the individual consumer choices matter. But we're in a system where we don't have some of the choices we need, right? Without an EV infrastructure, there's only so many EVs that we can buy because you can't go more than a certain distance.
But
so we need infrastructure and kind of broader systems change.
And do we need more people to be aware to put pressure on, let's say, the aviation companies, the airlines? That's one where I have guilt because I lived in the Bay Area my whole life. My husband moved us to Austin, Texas 3.5 years ago, and my daughter and stepkids live in New York. And so that's the hardest one for me to give up. And I know they're talking about and experimenting with cleaner fuels, but is that an area where if more people apply pressure, they would do it faster?
Yeah, I mean, that's one where I'm not sure how much the individual. I mean, yes, I think if you support the airlines that are experimenting with fuels, they're selling tickets now for things that have some biofuels in them. Those are some deep systemic issues. I mean, I've kind of felt for a long time, just technologically, that as we try to decarbonize the world, the last thing will probably be planes. I mean, one of the very last, right? We can do cars and increasingly trucks and commercial fleets.
Ships.
Planes are hard. I mean, and I don't think that we should completely stop flying. I think it's part of how we all stay connected. But look, the Zoom thing worked out far better than we all thought it would as we started the pandemic. So I've done no live talks since this started, no in-person talks, but virtually. It's not the same as gathering in person, but it's better than we thought. And so I think there's a lot of questions in business in particular about, do we need that meeting in person, especially maybe internal or people that we already know.
And it's not just flying, but driving. Obviously, more people working remotely means fewer cars on the road.
There's more remotely. There's, we need policy that invests in, high-speed rail and kind of infrastructure for transportation. We need all of that, and we're laggards in the U.S., unfortunately. I think flight is a tough one. I do believe in getting around, seeing the world, connecting to people in person, but I think we'll all maybe be flying less than we would have. I think that maybe an indefinite change. There'll just be more virtual things, and we'll be smarter about when is it really worth it? When do we really need to go?
I hope there's a lot more broad thoughtfulness, going into a trip. Do we really need to have that special European vacation?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem so appealing, at least for me. It comes with a lot of guilt, and that's okay, right? Because
Yep.
now we know what we know, and we just need to spread the awareness, because really it's going to take more than just the folks in the margin who have been there all along. We greenies, whatever, activists, climate experts, but it's got to go beyond that, which is why I've tried to do some this programming in mainstream news, and glad to be on Green TV. And thank you so much for your time, Andrew.
Thank you.
It's really great to see you again, and congratulations on your fourth book. Very, very impressive. I'm working on my first one still. And yeah, please spread the word about Green TV. And if you like what we're doing here, we have plans to grow to 24/7 at some point. And the sooner we get more subscribers, the sooner we can get some sponsors in, the sooner we can get some tech and production help and really grow, because there's no shortage of things to talk about. That idea is to program a 24/7 network. And, decided the CNNs of the world are not going to, they haven't even put a program on once a week devoted to these issues. Hello, existential threat or not, but we can do anything here because we're online. So I'm really excited about it, and hope our viewers will like it, share it, subscribe to it, and hear more conversations like this.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.